I'm reacting against my own pride and age here, so leave me the hell alone and complain and rant about this damn webcomic thing that shouldn't exist. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Irenicast. I'm your host, Jeff, and with me, as always, is my brother-in-law, Alan, and his cousin and my friend, Mona. We are post-evangelical ministers and theological thinkers grappling with our place in the progressive Christian world. Thank you for joining us for another conversation on faith and culture. This week, we are starting a brand new series on biblical interpretation, or how to read the Bible, or understanding the Bible, however you want to frame that. But way back in episode number 4, we did talk about the Bible because as post-evangelicals, the Bible was pretty central to our religious upbringing as far as what we were told and how we were to interact with it. In fact, I don't know about you guys, but the default solution when I was having a problem in life was from my pastors and leaders, read your Bible and pray more. But no one ever taught me, and I would say that's probably true for all of us, and we'll get into that as we get into the conversation, but no one really taught me how to study the Bible outside of go to the Bible bookstore, get your NIV study Bible, and then whatever the little comments at the bottom says. That's the real interpretation of it.
The one and real interpretation.
Exactly. And it wasn't until I got into college and started my theology degree in my biblical studies background that I started to realize there's so many more layers to how we're supposed to interpret this book. And I think, for me at least, that was the big number one thing that started pushing me away from evangelicalism, is that there wasn't this sense that there was a sense that the Bible was important, but the sense was more that the way we view the Bible is important, not studying the Bible is important.
Even that term, studying the Bible, is interesting.
Yeah. Oh, good question. Yeah.
What does it mean to study the Bible? Like we have Bible studies at churches, right? Bible study on Wednesday night. Let's study the Bible. You got to study your Bible. And what happens when we study the Bible? Like, where do we find meaning? Because there's all sorts of layers and questions you can ask the Bible, and all sorts of meanings come out of it. But, which way is legitimate, when it gives us the answers that we want? I think for me, it was expected that you would read the Bible in such a way that it was like kind of a pipeline from God to us of history. And that's basically it. You just read it, you believe it, you do it. Right. And, unfortunately that's not just an oversimplified way of looking at it. It actually leads to a lot of different problems, I think, for people. And for me personally, is like, where does the meaning come from? So when I'm reading a certain story, like, I have to kind of assume that this is important, right? Oh, these people killed these people. And it's like, what is this teaching me? I wasn't taught to study in a way that asks critical questions, but more like, how can I apply this immediately to my life? And, so I would think of things like, well, it's really important to worship God or you're going to die. Or maybe I need to kill my spiritual problems. I don't know. You know what I mean? It's like squeezing a lemon. Every morning I squeeze a lemon into my water. And it's kind of like, I have to squeeze all this meaning out of it in a certain way and get all the right answers. And unfortunately, it covered over all this meaning and this importance that I really do see in the Bible, that I've learned to start asking different questions and have helped me personally. But this episode gets me excited because the question really does stand. When you're coming out of an evangelical context, how do you look at the Bible? Like, how do you read it? Does it matter to you anymore? It does to me, but that question's different for everyone, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting that you said the word answers a couple of times, and I think that that resonates with me. Yeah, the Bible's you're taught that the Bible is your guidebook, your source of all wisdom, and this is a long history and evangelical tradition of biblical centrality. And really, I think we were encouraged to read it in the Pentecostal faith I grew up in a ahistorical way, because you are taught that the Holy Spirit, I'm using a little bit different language than you used just now, Alan, but that the Holy Spirit will give you understanding as you read. And so it doesn't really matter what happened, 2,000-3,000 years ago. What matters is what you're gleaning from it today. And so you're going to, read as a guidebook. And that's oversimplified. I think there's a lot of conservative and evangelical and Pentecostal people who read the Bible and really do understand a lot of the historical context. And so just to set the record for these episodes, we're not trying to correct any harsh wrongs. I would say, maybe you guys disagree, but we're not trying to tell anyone they're wrong in the way that they've approach the Bible per se. What we're trying to do is broaden the scope of, there's a lot of ways to read and study the Bible that aren't just looking for personal answers, but like you said, Alan, like open up tons of sources of meaning. And this is the result of scholarship in the last 100 years in particular, but stretching farther back than that. So how do we read this book or this collection of books? What do we do with it? And maybe how we can hold off seeking for personal answers and moral answers that apply directly to our lives. Just hold off on that a bit and look at some of these other ways of study.
I think that's a really good thing to bring up in the sense of what we're trying to accomplish with these things, because just like every one of us that are moving away from evangelicalism, we have this void that's there. And one of the main things within our evangelical tradition, like you were saying, is the Bible. So that our goal and hope through this is to provide a way to now keep that tradition of reading the Bible and holding it to a certain degree of relevance in your life, but with new tools that help maneuver through it, and the ones that we kind of had to discover in a sense the hard way.
Yeah. For me, the Bible is still very important and it's very central to my faith, but the new meaning, the new tools that are able to use are the only reason that it's still central for me, honestly. If I was stuck with interpreting the Bible as I was given, I don't know what I would do with it. I know a lot of people just move away from it completely, but discovering all of this other meaning is an important aspect of why the Bible means so much to me. I think out of all of our conversations, that's something that has kept coming up, is that I'm still so tied to this, and it's still so central. But that's specifically because of all of these other things that I've been introduced to. So if you're looking for a reason to stick with the Bible, they're out there.
That's funny you said that, actually, because before I started academic study of the Bible in seminary, I really did not like it, and I've actually learned to appreciate it a lot more because of these intellectual tools. It's like revived it for me, actually, and it's a lot more interesting. It's a lot more interesting. Like, my imagination is much more engaged reading the Bible with these academic tools that we're about to discuss in these next 3 episodes.
Yeah, so these episodes are going to be framed around some questions that Alan came up for this, because I think this was really came out of some of the stuff that Alan wanted, that we've all wanted to discuss. But as you know, through the history of the show, Alan gets particularly excited about these issues, and he came up with 3 kind of great questions that are going to help kind of guide the conversations for these next episodes. So today we really want to zero in on how do we read the Bible as literature. And then next week, talking about how is the Bible written over time, not only written, but read over time, because not every era of the church or the people of God have read it in the same way either. And then finally, how do we read the Bible in and out of its original context and bridge those different gaps? So, Alan, would you say that that's an accurate description of the direction that you were thinking we should head with these conversations?
Yes. There's a lot of different ways, a lot of different questions that fall into a bunch of different subgroups, but that's a good breakdown of sort of the main umbrellas of different areas that we could dive into. I think all of 3 of those things, the Bible is literature, the Bible's development over time or being read over time, and the Bible in and out of its original context, I think all of them touch upon one major thing for me at the very beginning, and that is where I believe the Bible's inspired, and I believe it's important, and I do believe it is connected to God, but where is meaning located? Like, where is the meaning that God has for people, for me? Where is that located? Is it in, the microscopic level, like looking at the definition of one word and breaking it down? Yeah, probably. Is it in like the mountain view? If you zoom out 10,000 miles and look at the Bible or a book in the Bible as a whole, is it in there? Or is it in the way that pieces are put together or in the flow? And beginning to ask questions that are big like that, you kind of let God or the Spirit or whatever's happening in the Bible do its thing. Instead of restricting it, it's more of a way of listening and thinking about maybe God uses literature and not just... That's the big thing for me. I used to believe that God could only speak in one way, that God could only influence, human culture in a certain way and interact in a certain way. But once I allowed God to speak through literature and ancient literature, it blew up my mind and my faith into this new realm where I found so much more meaning, and it was honestly so much more rewarding to read the Bible. So today is about literature.
Yeah, today's about literature. And I want to say a quick note, too, for those of you who are listening who feel uncomfortable with the academic study of the Bible, because there's a long tradition of this in some communities, that that people who study the Bible academically are trying to erase the spirituality from the Bible or erase the divinity of Jesus or any of the above, right? So it can be perceived as very threatening. And it's funny because even when I started studying the Bible academically, even though I was kind of, like I said earlier, done with the Bible and mad at it, just I'm done with this. I don't want to study it anymore. Even when I started to study it academically in seminary, it still felt threatening. It still felt threatening to treat the Bible like with scientific method. So I want to say to those of you who might come to this with a bit of reluctance, okay, no one's trying to take your faith away. First of all, nobody's trying to take your faith away. What we're trying to learn to do is to put on different lenses. And we use that word a lot in the academic world, right? So if you ever worn a pair of sunglasses that have like a rose color or a yellow color or a blue color, and you put them on and you might not be able to see the color of the lens, right? So it might block out some information, but you're able to see other things come into highlight or come into view that you didn't see before as clearly or you didn't notice before. Okay, so we're putting lenses off and then we're on and then we're taking them off. It's not something that has to stay permanently affixed to your face. You're just using it temporarily to gain a different perspective. And then you can put on a different lens and then you can put on a different lens, right? So it doesn't have to be threatening. I just want to say a note to that, to those of you who come at this from that perspective.
Yeah. And I think also along with that, it's important to recognize that when we're talking about meaning, we may not be talking about meaning in the sense of what previously was insinuated in our evangelical context, like not answers. And we kind of talk
Capital
about this.
A.
We're not looking for like the answers to the universe, but meaning. And we forget sometimes as we talk about the Bible as literature, we forget that it is literature. And we forget also that the Hebrew scriptures are beautifully written ancient documents. Like, they're beautiful literature. That's why community colleges and even regular secular colleges across America still teach a class on the Bible as literature, because there's beautiful poetry in it. There's beautiful prose and narrative that are a part of the cultural landscape of the ancient Near East during that time. And it's important for us to have moments where we approach the text in that way and just appreciate it for what it is, in the same way that we would appreciate a beautiful movie or a song that bring meaning to our lives but don't necessarily give us answers. And I think that's an important way that we forget to approach the Bible, especially in the context of it as literature.
So you can still hold the canonicity of it while seeing it as literature. Yeah.
I was going to say that God is still, for me, you can still see God as operative in that. To call it literature, to call it, ancient literature, is not to say that it's irrelevant. It's to say that God might be operating differently than we first expect when we read something. So at the end of this session this morning, my hope is that people will be able to look at the Bible. Like when I first came into seminary, the Bible was very flat, right? It had like one meaning across the whole thing.
Two-dimensional.
Yeah, two-dimensional. It was like none of it contradicts. There's no tensions. There's no, it all agrees, and it's all this one projection of God's word for the world. And now, like when I hold my Bible, it's more like holding an encyclopedia. It's more like holding a collection of poems and different works and things that have different structures and purposes for even being written. And my hope when I read the Bible is that I can listen to the writers in their own way. Instead of forcing meaning onto the text, for me, I love to see meaning come out of it. Some people talk about the difference between eisegesis and exegesis, as in letting the text speak for itself and bringing meaning out of it being exegesis, and eisegesis being, making it say what we want it to say and injecting our own meaning. And I think we do that on the whole when it comes to different genres. So the very first thing we do in talking about the Bible as literature is think about the Bible as different genres. Like, you wouldn't pick up a collection of poems from an American poet and expect to learn about how to fix your car. If it's a poem about a car, you're expecting to learn certain things, but you're not going to read it in the same way as you would a manual. So there are all kinds of genres in the Bible, and the very first step is kind of figuring out what genre the book you're reading or the work you're reading is in.
Yeah, because all the genres have different purposes. They all had completely different purposes according to the original writers, like you said, Alan. So yeah, a book of poetry and a book of law, they both have intention and they both have meaning in them, but they have different purposes and they should be read differently. It's funny. I taught music for a year to like grade school kids. It was a really long year, and I don't think about it often. But we did a Books of the Bible song. It was at a Christian school. And I remember the day that I put on the whole list of the books of the Bible, start to finish, on the projector, and I showed the kids, hey kids, like this breaks down like the first 5 books. You call that the Pentateuch, and then we have law, and then we have wisdom books, and we have Psalms, and then we have prophecy, and then we have Apocalypse and Gospel and Epistles. And the teachers were like, oh my God, I've been going to church my whole life, and I've never heard anyone explain this to me, that the Bible is actually organized by genre to some degree. A lot of the books have actually micro genres within them. So there could be Psalms and law laid right next to each other, right? Or poetry and law laid next to each other. But for the most part, when the canonizers, what do you call them? People putting the canon together for the Christian Bible organized these books in a way that makes it easy for us to access. So that's kind of cool if you've never heard that before.
And the Hebrew Bible as well. The people who put that together and compiled it did the same with like major prophets, lesser prophets, law, history, different things like that.
And I think it's important also to realize that when we speak of literature, I think what we have in our head is us sitting down and reading a book or reading a poem or whatever, but the majority of the people or the original audience that these literary genres were intended for were to listen, to hear. So as part of this, it's not only just like what's the meaning, but what was the author intending to invoke from its listeners, which I think is an important thing, because we've kind of regulated scripture reading as just this part of a service where we just read a verse or whatever. But there's an art form to even that part of it, and how the literature was heard.
Yeah, definitely. There's a German phrase that biblical scholars like to use called the Sitz im Leben. Sitzimleben. Sitz im Leben. It means setting in life. So it's actually a really helpful tool to uncovering the intention behind these texts, right? What were the texts meant to do? Was this a song that was sung in the temple for the whole of the society to enjoy together? Or was this a scroll sitting on the shelf of a scribe somewhere in a school of history? So understanding the Sitz im Leben, or the setting in life, helps us understand how to read the books today as literature.
For instance, if you took one of the Psalms, which would likely be sung in the temple, and you looked at it like law, you might confuse things. Like, I always think about the Psalms that pray to God to have God like punish the wicked, break their teeth, like kill these people, imprecatory prayers. If you just read those by yourself, like I read in the backyard each morning, if I just opened up my Bible and I read through that and I thought about those being completely appropriate things for me to do as a person, instructive for the youth or something, I'm going to go to a youth group and be like, it's important that we kill wicked people, I would completely miss the fact that these were songs sung by an oppressed people. It was in a situation that's very different than mine, and the meaning might be located in the fact that songs sung to God out of the depths of our heart and the things that we're actually feeling is appropriate. Maybe that's the level of meaning that I can extract from that, as opposed to looking at it with a microscope thinking other questions, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely.
One example.
It's a really good example. Like when you were saying that, I was thinking about this psalm that says, we wish that you would dash the heads of the Babylonian babies against the rocks, right? That's a really famous, really violent passage. So if you just look at the Bible on like a verse by verse basis, or even like a few verses basis, and you don't see the larger genre context, you can miss some really important stuff, and you're really prone to misinterpret the whole thing. Like you said, Alan, if you just take that verse and just apply it to life, like you miss the whole idea that expressing feelings are within the strong religious tradition that is considered good, so.
Giving space to oppressed people to cry out to God.
You miss the political context. Yeah.
Might be the meaning. Yeah.
And you miss the beautiful nuance of certain things. Like one of my favorite books of the Hebrew Scriptures is Jonah. It is this beautifully laid out narrative. Like it is the perfect story. It's like textbook. You know, you have the first 2 chapters paralleling the second 2 chapters, and there's all these little things that are building this beautiful, wonderful story. And we've regulated it to, well, there's no way he could be in the belly of a whale for 3 days. You know what I mean? Like we concentrate on the wrong things, and we miss the beauty and nuance and intricacy of all these beautiful narratives that are there.
Yeah, that's actually, there's a name for that genre, is historical biblical epic. And so it's interesting if you can identify that Jonah's a historical epic or a narrative epic. What other epics do we know about? Oh, Homer's Iliad. Oh, we can read those maybe in common because they weren't written that far apart. Maybe
the
how do
Epic
they?
of Gilgamesh. Yep.
Yeah, maybe how do they have similar plot points, or how do they function the same way? How do they climax the same way? How do they have the same or different kinds of revolutions? How do each of these characters relate to their respective gods? How do they experience conflict? You can start to tease out a lot of the motifs in the text if you treat it as literature and see things that you maybe wouldn't have appreciated before.
And the main meaning for the author, him or herself, might actually be the step away from the genre that they're making. You read Genesis and you look at other creation accounts that surround the area. Maybe there's a usual way of creating, this epic or this tale or whatever, and the break from regular structure might be the most significant thing. But we might miss it because we're trying, like you said, trying to recreate the history. And here's step number 1 for me. For me, as a post-evangelical, quasi-evangelical, whatever the heck I am, when I read the Bible, it used to be that I was creating in my mind a historical setting and just putting all the pieces together. This is just straight history. When I read the Gospels, when I read the Hebrew Bible, I'm thinking in terms of history. So I have a puzzle and I'm putting it together, and I have a timeline in my brain, and everything that is said is absolutely historical, and that's how I have to read it. It's taking a step back from that and thinking of these books as books, you can start to ask different questions that have a whole set of different meanings. Like looking at a gospel, instead of looking at it as this little chunk of this is what Jesus' life looked like, A plus B equals C, and then you make this little timeline. You can start to ask questions like, what is the author doing right now? Why is the author saying this here instead of over there? And why is the author juxtaposing these 2 stories? And ask better questions like that. Is it okay if I just jump into an example of how I like to read the Gospels?
We don't like examples here. Stay in theory only.
No examples.
I literally have my Bible open.
No
so
telling
this
stories.
Is kind of exciting. This is kind of exciting.
You just ruined the whole thing for me, Alan. Your Bible's open. I feel like everything you say is going to be a sermon.
It's going to be. Probably my favorite example of how I like to read, especially the Gospels, would be in Mark chapter 6. All throughout the book of Mark, there's all kinds of topics that are interesting, that if you just read little chunks of it, you don't really get what the author is doing. One of those is sight. Like the disciples fail to see who Jesus is, but all these outsiders are being healed, right? And their sight's being opened, and sight's an important motif. And reading the development of sight, or maybe unnamed women in the story, or food itself and how food functions, are the types of narrative questions that you can ask that bring out meaning. And for me, my favorite juxtaposition of 2 stories is the feast with Herod, the king, who is, oppressing John the Baptist and Jesus' followers, and then the feeding of the 5,000. So you have Herod in a banquet, and his daughter is doing a dance, right? And she's very... what's the word? She's very convincing, okay? And she's doing this dance and entertaining all these people. And he tells her, you can name up to half of my kingdom. Whatever you want, I will give it to you, right? And she says, I want John the Baptist's head on a platter. Well, Herod has this moment where he doesn't want to kill John the Baptist for a lot of different, political reasons, that this is not a good thing. He shouldn't have done this. He's caught in this trap where, although he's a king, now he's beholden to this person who's asking something he shouldn't do. Anyway, he has John the Baptist executed. And then in the very next part of the chapter, the very next story, is Jesus going out into the wilderness. So he's not in the palace, right? Jesus sits people down in these groups. And sitting them down in the groups, they're sitting in banqueting style groups. It's very technical language. So it's this sharp contrast between a king with a feast, with feasting groups, who is beholden to the people he should be leading. He's not acting like a king. And here you have Jesus feeding these people in the wilderness, in these banqueting groups, and he's actually delegating. He's not the one who is at the whim and will of the people. He's telling his disciples to go out and feed one another. So it's super interesting, the difference that the author is setting up between the supposed king and the real one, and how the two, in one instance, you have a king dealing death, and in the other, you have this miraculous expression of bringing life from nothing, for the people who are like the least of these. And so the concepts of king and kingdom come up over and over and over in that book. But in this one instance, it's a very sharp distinction between what the world thinks is a king and what this author thinks a king should actually be doing in Jesus.
Fascinating.
Yeah, it's I think the hinge in this case for me is when Jesus looks at the crowd. It says that Jesus sees them as sheep without a shepherd. And that's a direct criticism of the leadership of Herod Antipas, is that he's not actually leading the people. And what they need is somebody to lead in the way that Jesus would. So those are all meanings that you would totally miss. If you would just look at, the miracle, there's 5,000 people. That must mean this, asking certain questions, which are okay. We should be able to ask those questions. But if those are the only questions we ask, we miss the larger thing that's happening in the story.
So by teasing out those nuances in the text, in the genre, in the literature, and the way the story has been composed, you were able to see what the author was trying to do with it, and the author's voice comes through more, right? Is that how you would say it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That the author has an agenda is an important thing to think about.
And a note about that, there's actually a lot of the books of the Bible, we don't actually know who wrote them. It's in older biblical literature studies, like people thought like Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. And we know pretty certainly nowadays that that's not true. It's much more possible that whole schools of scholars and scribes composed these books together or edited them over time, which we'll talk about more later. But when you really start studying like the Hebrew or the Greek of some of these books, especially in the Jewish Bible, which note, we say the Jewish Bible instead of Old Testament because the words Old Testament really came out of an anti-Semitic period of Christian biblical interpretation and criticism that tried to erase the Jewishness of the Bible. So we say the Jewish Bible because we want to be mindful that is the complete holy works of another world religion, right? It
helps respect the books for what they're actually doing.
Yeah,
it goes against the levelingness, right? Instead of forcing our perspective on the books, it's giving them space to say what they're actually saying, to recognize that they had a meaning when they were originally written. Not
and those terms are automatically creating one lesser than the other.
Right, old and new. Yeah. Well, because for centuries, right, going back to Irenaeus, Tertullian, Augustine, or early church fathers, it was completely appropriate and considered a good thing to see like analogies and typographies or typographies. Is that the word? No, not typographies. What's the word I'm looking for? Typology. Thank you. Typologies in the quote unquote Old Testament. So they would say, this whole story of David, that whole thing was just written to point to Jesus. And it doesn't have very much historical merit. So we can just read Jesus back into it like retroactively. But
and there's
nowadays,
some of that actually happens in the Bible. But you're right.
In the New Testament, but yeah.
New extent. Yeah. And there's a lot of allegorical. The technical term during that time would be the allegorical interpretation. Like, the gates of Eden represent Mary's legs being opened and Jesus being born. Like literally, that's one of the. I think that might have been Origen who said that.
So
but that wasn't a totally appropriate.
I didn't hear that one in Sunday school.
Really? Yeah, seriously. So that would be considered like interpretive acrobatics. So we're not going that direction.
It's one way to go.
But it's not considered a quote unquote legitimate way to go these days. Like we're intent on treating the Jewish Bible as the Jewish Bible. But once you get into the study of this stuff, you realize that there's tremendous complexity in the original language that doesn't transfer over into English. And I'll tell a brief story about my experience with biblical interpretation. So I was taking a class on the prophets, and and this, Alan, your story reminded me of this. And I had to do a presentation on the book of Ezekiel. And I was so mad about it because Ezekiel is some of the most violent imagery in the Old Testament regarding violence against women. It not specifically because it's talking about Israel, right? As using the metaphor of a woman who has been quote unquote whorish, and the prophecies in Ezekiel say that God is going to give Israel over to her, the people she's been unfaithful with, and they will dismember her and kill her, and because she's this unfaithful whore of a woman. Like it's awful. It's awful. Ezekiel 16 in particular is so violent. So I was really frustrated and felt sick that I had to do this presentation. So I get into the study of this and I realize, Ezekiel is one of the most complexly written books. Not only the imagery, but the way this book is written is not accidental. It's actually very carefully constructed in a chiasmic structure, CHIASM, chiasmic, which means it has this completely symmetrical parallel climax and decline. So the verses on either side of that action correlate directly with each other throughout the whole book and within individual chapters. So the structure of it, like if you could map it visually, it's absolutely breathtakingly beautiful. The content of it is problematic for our modern ears. So I started doing more work with this book and how do I explain this, or how, not even to explain it, but to understand it in a way that doesn't make me feel sick to my stomach, because I can't, my modern ears, my modern conception of, you just don't use violent imagery about women when you're trying to talk about politics. You just don't do it, so I can't stomach that today. So I'm starting to do more work on this, and I'm saying, okay, so I'm using a literary lens. I've got my literary glasses on that are, showing me some things. What if I put another set of lenses on there that showed me a completely different thing? So I'm using a literary lens. And then on top of that lens, I'm using a cultural post-colonial trauma theory lens. So Ezekiel as the book takes place, it not necessarily was written during, but that setting was during and after the Babylonian exile. So this is during a time when this people who fought so hard to keep their culture and their nation together, been invaded by the Babylonian Empire. They've had all of their structures, like their institutions, decimated. All of their intelligent people, like all of their cultural leaders, have been exported, and they're just left in this like smoldering ashes of what they once were. Okay, so if you're using a lens of cultural trauma, you can say this is a people who've been through something akin to psychological genocide. They've had all of their structures dismantled. And so, wow, that really gives me a new perspective for understanding why they would use such strongly violent language about what's happening to their country and why God might be judging them or trying to understand or trying to make meaning of it. So if you read these passages with a literary lens and maybe with some other things helping to inform you, start understanding the meaning of the grief that's occurring in this book and what they're trying to express, right? And then once I started seeing that, I started seeing all these ties between maybe that situation and some contemporary political situations where people, are where their country or culture or societies have been dismantled by war, and they're refugees or they've been in captivity, so you start seeing things that you wouldn't otherwise be able to see, is the whole point of that story.
And those are things that we're definitely going to be addressing even more in the other episodes, like reader response, in and out of context, social, historical context, stuff like that. Because all of these layers of meanings touch upon each other. They're not cleanly cut. They're all interconnected. So it's easy to slap a label, but you're right. Like when you read, you have a lot of different lenses on at the same time. It's not just one or the other.
But the reason we start with literature is because
it's literature. because it is a narrative, or, it's the only way to really understand what's happening is to begin with the idea that there is an author with a perspective, with an agenda.
And this was used for a certain purpose. So that's what you're trying to get out first before anything else.
As we're talking about this, I think some practical tools that we can walk away from it is going back a little bit to what Alan was talking about with the Gospels, where he mentions the juxtaposition of these two stories, is that as we're reading, one of the things that I found was helpful was, and then also connected with what Mona was saying, is looking for words and symbols that pop up on a regular basis. So if you're reading a passage and you notice, wow, they're using this word a lot, don't take that for granted. Like, stop and look that word up and find out if it's the same word in the original language. And then also for different symbols. Like if you read through the book of John, I encourage you to stop and look every time a garden or water is mentioned. Those are important symbols that are trying to paint this large picture of the narrative. And these little things, you know, as you pick up, they seem little initially, but the meaning and the depth of what those things are trying to tell can bring a lot to your time as you're trying to reframe how you're going to read the Bible and how you're going to look at it.
Awesome. How a word is used in one single book is a massive tool to be able to understand what's happening. That's good. I think another thing I would add to the toolkit would be intertextuality. So when something is mentioned in a text, it could be an allusion to something completely different. So when you read the Gospels, there's like these mentions of things like Son of Man or other ideas that are actually calling on cultural items that have existed for Jewish people in the Hebrew Bible long before. Like Daniel, like I can't even imagine trying to interpret or read through Mark without an understanding of Daniel, without an understanding of the function of the Son of Man in Daniel and how that's being applied in Mark. I'll give you one instance of this. Probably my favorite would be 1 Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians 10, Paul's making this argument, and then he randomly starts saying that, you know, they all drank from the same spiritual drink. He's talking about Jewish people. They all drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. So he's reading back into the story of the Jewish people in the wilderness and their experience of this rock that gave them water. And he's saying that rock was Christ. But that phrase, the rock that followed them, doesn't even make sense to us. I read that in my life and just skipped completely over it. Right? They don't. But in rabbinical literature, in the tradition, it was said that a rock actually rolled and followed the Jewish people. You won't find this in the Hebrew Bible, right? In the canon of the Hebrew Bible. But there was extra biblical literature that said, yeah, there was this rock that followed them. So Paul is actually making a cultural reference to a different text that we don't even necessarily know about. And so there's this meaning that is being imported. He's drawing on this meaning. And if we don't have the original text, it's hard to see what he's actually doing. So all throughout the Bible, I mean, I think I gave this example before, but if somebody said something about chopping down a cherry tree, because you're an American, you might know that there's a story about, you know, George Washington chopping down a cherry tree and telling the truth and stuff like that. It might call up all of this meaning for you. As someone else, if they read it, they might not see it. I just want to say every single text in your Bible that you have in your hand is filled with intertextual allusions. And so just spending time getting to know them is one area that you might find things that you've never known.
And we shouldn't be surprised about this. Like every culture has idioms that are, you know, congruent with what they're talking about. Like one of the ones that comes to mind always when I think about this idea is our use of the I don't know if you've heard the term jump the shark.
Yes.
Oh yeah, I've heard that. I don't know what it's called. It's from though.
So jump the shark, like we'll say, like if a TV show like gets really ridiculous, we'll say it's jump the shark. Well, it's a reference to Happy Days when the Fonz was water skiing and he jumped over a shark in one episode. And for that, the fans of that show, it became this moment where like, this is too ridiculous. We can't stay on board. We're done with the show. So now anytime something like gets too ridiculous within its own context, we say it's jump the shark.
I'm totally going to use that now. I never knew what that meant. But we do that all the time, right? Like, even internet memes take on a life of their own, and they become inside jokes, you know? So there's, like you're saying, something similar happens there, Alan. Like, those references mean something to the original hearers, and that's how they were preserved.
Even on a big scale, it's more than just idioms or sayings. You can read an entire gospel as an attempt to explain one chapter in Daniel. You know what I mean? It might have massive import. It's not just...
Well, a more obvious example of that is the beginning of the book of John. In the beginning, you know, I mean, there's a clear reference to Genesis in the way that they're beginning to start that. And we see this, you know, good art references other art. You know what I mean? Going back to that whole jump the shark thing, there was a episode in Arrested Development where Henry Winkler, the guy who played the Fonz, literally jumped over a shark.
No,
Like,
I missed that. And I love that show. That's so funny. See, you have to know the receptivity. Okay, so I want to add another tool to the toolkit. Also is similar to what you guys were saying. The lens of the author during their writing, not just the intention or the meaning, but like who the author might sympathize with or be writing to is really, really important. And I'll give you an example. In the opening couple chapters of Matthew, the author of Matthew goes to a lot of lengths to establish Jesus's Jewish genealogy and his Jewishness. And the king of the Jews, Jesus is the king of the Jews. And a lot of the language being used in the book of Matthew is very, very Jewish. Whereas if you read the introduction of Luke, it's, I'm writing to you, most excellent Theophilus, to a Greek name, either a Hellenized Jew or a Gentile, a Greek Gentile. So Luke is not really emphasizing Jesus's Jewishness, nor is that its intention. It's trying to explain the gospel to a Gentile audience. So you see, and it's funny because you can read Matthew and Luke in parallel, and there's a ton of crossover, which we'll talk about in our next couple episodes of this series. But the authors themselves had very, very, very different, I don't want to use the word agenda because that sounds sneaky, but they had different goals for what that text was meant to be doing. Yeah.
I think agenda is a perfect way to say it.
Agenda? You think
yeah,
so?
I think there's... honestly, read 1st and 2nd Kings versus 1st and 2nd Chronicles and tell me that those two that are talking about the same kind of history do not have completely different agendas, because they do.
And it's important in that to delineate also not only the time frame in which the author is writing about, but the time frame in which they are writing about that time frame, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Like the context in which they're writing it can sometimes influence the way they look back at a certain thing. Like if I wrote something today about the 70s, I have not just the context and what I know historically about the 70s, but I also have 30 years of stereotypes and rhetoric and certain perception of what the 70s is. So that's a balance between those two things as well. There's a great book that I read recently on the Gospels that kind of talk about the era in which they were written, and I think it's called Heart and Mind, and it's this really good book about really why we have the Gospels formed the way they are, and in connection to the liturgy actually, and the 3-year reading cycle, and how each of the contexts in which they were written, even though they're writing about the same period, really influences the way they structure them.
Yeah, and that's something again that we'll be touching on in the 3rd episode on context, because you're right. It's not like there was this spirit hovering. It's not like the author themselves are this disembodied person watching everything happen, right?
God told them, Alan. God told them.
Let's add another layer of complexity on that. Some biblical prophecy, and this will take, if you're interested in this, go research it. But sometimes the ways that Jewish scribes would write history is as if it were going to happen. So they write it in a prophetic genre. They're describing past events, but they're talking about it in future tense. So that's where things get really complicated, I think, especially for those of us coming out of a conservative place where prophecy is a really high pedestal. Like I talked to someone who was still... Yeah, I talked to someone a couple of years ago who is maintaining evangelical Christian faith because of prophecy, because of biblical prophecy. Like, well, if God can give people, insight into the future, then God must be real. This is miraculous. This is, and I didn't want to burst their bubble at the time, but like a lot of prophecy was written in hindsight. I'm sorry to tell you. It's true. Or it was at least edited, what we call redacted in hindsight, which we'll talk more about later. But it's important to know that when you're reading stuff in the Bible, like that seems really futuristic, like Daniel, like you said, Alan, or like Revelation, it's actually describing past or current events in ways that seem really fantastical. So,
and that's not necessarily meant to be tricky. It's not necessarily meant to deceive people. Like people think that, if that was written after the fact, but they're not being honest about it. That's not how literature operated in the ancient world. So
that's not how history operated either. And I think that's important, is that that history was based off of narrative, the lessons that we're learning and how this is going to happen. So, but I think before we can get sidetracked, are there any, because we got to wrap this up, are there any last things that we want to point people towards. And I'll just say right now that you'll definitely want to check out the show notes for this particular episode and the next two. Not that you ordinarily wouldn't, but for this one in particular, we're going to have a list of books and materials that we didn't necessarily mention in this conversation, along with kind of an outline of some of the things that we're talking about, because we genuinely want this to be a resource for people to be able to have in their toolbox, so to speak, if they really want to investigate Scripture in a new way in their post-evangelical journey.
So I want to recommend a really helpful tool. And this is funny because when I was going into this study, I was like, oh no, this is a really liberal resource. Like, I'm going to lose my faith. Okay, so just think about it. It's not liberal, it's academic. Okay, so everyone can use this. It's the New Oxford Annotated NRSV Bible with Apocrypha. So this is like the keynote study Bible for anyone doing academic reading of the text. And instead of footnotes like, oh, this Bible verse will help you with your life and your relationships, it's like, notes on archaeology and history and criticism lineage. So it's the Bible is notated with study references from scholars instead of from pastors or whatever. So it's a really helpful resource to just help you start asking better questions or to have different lenses as you read the text. And it's got the Apocrypha, which are the books that were written in between the Jewish Bible and the New Testament period. So it opens up a lot of resources there for reading other material that both Jewish Bible and New Testament reference, but that Protestants in particular don't often know. So I recommend that. And I also recommend a book called How to Read the Bible as Literature by Leland Ryken. He's one of the foremost scholars in Bible as literature. And I got to take a class with him. And the best day of that class was when we were talking about satire as a biblical genre. And he brought fake cigarettes for us all to sit and pretend to smoke during class. It was really great. But that'll give you a really good insight because he's a literary scholar and he reads the Bible as if he's reading like any great literary work of art. And you'll see stuff that you've never, ever thought of seeing before. So that's his books are a really great resource.
What's important when you begin to read any specific work in the Bible, identify its genre, try to think deeply about what genre is this? How is it functioning? Look for topics, like ideas that keep coming up over and over, or themes. Look for juxtaposition, things that are set next to each other. Try to identify irony. One of my favorite things is irony. There's a lot of irony in the Bible that's supposed to be there that we might miss if we think that it's not going to be ironic or sarcastic. Look for humor, comedy, tragedy, some of these, traditional things that are happening. And then I would recommend, if something pops out to you, a word, Jeff mentioned looking up how a word is used throughout one work or one text, look up the website Blue Letter Bible. It's a resource that was given by Daniel Kirk. It's just this, it's pretty plain, but it does the job. Go in and type in the verse you're looking at, and you can actually click the word, and you can find out the meaning of the word in the original languages. And you can also see how many times that word was used in that specific book. So just looking up how many times and where those words show up connect bigger ideas. So give it a shot. Get your literary narrative criticism on and start to look at things a little bit differently. And I promise that there will be meanings that you may never have thought of before that God might really be intending for us to think about and use. And then there are just 3 books that I would recommend. As always, Struggling with Scripture, Walter Brueggemann, Platcher, Blount, and others write in this book. It's a pretty thin one, and it's good just to kind of take a step out of the lens that you've been using before and maybe consider some other ones. The Last Word by N.T. Wright, I read it years ago when I was very much evangelical. I very much used one lens when I read the Bible. This one helped me step out of that to some degree. And lastly, thirdly, Reading the Bible Again for the First Time by Marcus Borg. Taking the Bible Seriously but Not Literally is the subtitle. I'm only in the beginning part of this book, but it's helping me reframe my mind about ways I can ask questions and read the Bible differently. So I would recommend that as well.
I have one more resource to recommend. In addition to the online resource, I love the website BibleHub.com. So if you go there and you enter in the main search bar any passage of scripture. And then 2 lines below it, there's kind of some different words. If you click on interlinear, it'll show you the original Hebrew with the English right underneath that corresponds to that word. It's such a cool reference. And then you can click on the numbers that refer to the concordance. So you can see that word that's being used in that passage alongside every other instance of the word. It is the coolest, most 3-dimensional online Bible tool that I've ever come across. And if you have no Greek or Hebrew training, you can still use it and make good use out of it. So yeah, Bible Hub Interlinear Study is very good.
And she was not paid to say that.
I was not paid.
Not yet.
I wish someone paid us to say something. Anyway, I'm not going to add to the long list. We'll provide something in the show notes as far as all the list of things that mentioned here and then not mentioned here, and this will be kind of ongoing as we go through the thing. So let us know what you think. Let us know if you have any resources to add to this particular episode, and you can do that in the comment section at irenicast.com/63, and there you'll find the links and the information for all the stuff that we're talking about. And then for any other questions, comments, or concerns, or suggestions for the show in general, you can find all the ways to contact us at irenicast.com/feedback. On the other side of music, we're going to be bringing back a segment called Pursuit of the Trivial. So this is our second round of Pursuit of the Trivial. The first time we did this was in episode 34, our Halloween episode. And basically the premise of this is very Seinfeldian in nature, where each of us have come up with a topic or a question that is pretty trivial when you think about it, but we're going to have maybe not lengthy, but we're going to have heated discussion or debate about these particularly trivial questions or issues. That sounds about right?
Yeah, I feel strongly about things that don't matter, so this works for me.
Yeah. I think we all do on a certain level.
I try to practice nonsense as a spiritual component of my life.
A spiritual discipline.
Because, spiritual discipline of nonsense, because like sense makes more sense when there's nonsense
there you go.
involved. I think, to like highlight its importance. We're existing in the inverse, the shadow side of sense, you could say. Can I go first? Because I'm just on a roll with the talking.
You might as well. Go for it.
Okay. What, in your opinion, this is a really important, like, life-changing debate that's about to happen, okay? This says a lot about you as a person and your moral character and your taste in both beauty and love. What, in your opinion, is the best webcomic on the internet?
Webcomic?
Think about it long and hard. It's very important. You're the best webcomic
Sorry,
out there.
I tried not to say a joke about what you just said.
I'm not sure what a webcomic is.
Oh my god!
So there you go. Jeff's already,
Jeff, you lost so hard.
This is wrong because a lot of it isn't funny and it's probably a little offensive at times, but I probably laugh the hardest or smile the most when I look at cyanide and happiness. Very, very inappropriate. Probably shouldn't even say it out loud.
No, that's great. I like inappropriate humor.
Okay. I'm a comic book fan. I'm a comic fan, but when this is making me feel old. But when did this become a thing? It's just
oh my gosh.
So from what I understand, it's just
oh my gosh.
No. Like I understand that the web has always had different comics, but when did it become its own genre just because of the platform it's published on?
Oh
because it's only published on the web. It's just like you wouldn't call a blog a newspaper. If it's only published on the web, it's a web comic.
No. Okay, so here's my trivial thing about this. That doesn't
Googling
make any sense.
the word webcomic right now.
Why no?
Well, if you published a book and all you did was a digital version on
then you'd have an
Amazon,
ebook.
It's still a book.
No, it's an ebook.
The ebook is how you read it, the form, but it's still a book
so
itself.
it's still a comic, but it's a web book.
Yeah.
It's
so it's a digital comic then.
Well, digital comic I think would mean like comic book style, right? Web comic just like a comic strip, but like online web comic. It's a shorter format.
It's a real thing, dude.
No, I get that it's a real thing, but I think it's silly. Like, why? Just
why?
because
why
of the.
Is it silly? People can do
just call it a comic that is on the web. Like, I don't know. It doesn't need to be its
comic
own
that is on the
genre
web.
just
Web
because
comic
of
is
what it's
shorter.
printed on or not printed on.
Why can't there be its own genre? Why? Why is that?
Okay, well, It makes me mad more than
comic on
anything
the
else
web,
that I
not a
didn't know
web
about
comic.
it. So I'm reacting against my own pride and age here. So leave me the hell alone and complain and rant about this damn webcomic thing that shouldn't exist.
You want the word to go away. You want it to say comic, right?
It's just a comic.
I'll
But then
tell
you'll
you
be
why.
like, but then you'll march down to your comic store and you'll be like, hey, may I buy this comic that is on the web?
No, okay.
You're diminishing
I
the
have heard
artist by
tale of
not
it.
including them in the pantheon of all that is good in comics.
It
It
would
is. It's
actually
still a
ruin
comic.
it ruins the nature of comics in general to include web comics with them, because usually web comics are not up to the scale that you would think.
I would say most of the Sunday paper ones are worse than anything I've seen on the web. But I didn't know that there were
those are
like
the
They
comics.
are. No, that's true. Web comics are better than newspaper comics. For
No,
sure.
but
Agreed.
web comics have less artistry in my experience. They don't
Yeah, they're
put as much
faster
thought.
turnaround.
Yeah. So when you say comics from a comic book store, I think of art, right? I think of like actual people doing hand drawing
Although-
like art or whatever. And then when I think of web comic, I think of stick figures, and to throw them into the same category just feels wrong.
No, because there is an epic webcomic that has so much artistry that I was going to mention is my favorite, which is Hyperbole and a Half. And that
Ooh,
artist does
yes.
amazing work all in Microsoft Paint.
Way
but
better.
really incredible artwork. with
Way
that
better
one.
than Cyanide and Happiness.
And storytelling.
Vicky and I actually bought her book because she put out a book of a collection of her web comics. Talk about
Her
like
stuff makes me laugh so
you mean her
hard.
punching
comics
you in the
that happen to be
heart
on the web?
no,
Jeff,
it was on the web.
Stop
Hey,
trying to make that happen.
talk about like a web comic. Talk about something that just hits you right in the chest. Man, her stuff
Yeah.
on depression and just wonderful. That sounds weird
It's
to
very
say, but-
real. Yeah, her
Those
stuff is
sound like
very real.
great comics, and I will check those out.
Check it out.
Dude,
Yeah,
Hyperbole
check it
and a
out.
Half.
Well, so she started on the web as like just this simple blog and blew up to like a million viewers and then got a book deal. So now is in print comic and has like full illustrated like books
So then-
out.
Okay,
But
that sounds amazing. But
she's
then that
still
does
a
that.
web comic.
So, but she's been published. So when does it not become a web? Its
It's
origins
still-
have to be in the web.
I think so.
Yes.
I mean,
And who says web
defines these
anymore?
things?
Really? Come on.
Jeff, you're so mad.
I think once you start ingesting some web comics, you'll realize they're just different. You know,
The Oatmeal
They're
is
MS
another
Paint.
one that has a ton of artistry to it. The Oatmeal's hilarious and also crass, just to warn you. But
I'm all for
Very
all
good.
of this. I just think that they've named it poorly.
So mine, I guess it's kind of a question because it always makes me feel uncomfortable when it happens. But when you order food and you go to pick it up, do you tip people that like bag the food for you at a restaurant?
yeah, of course you tip.
How much? 20%?
You could tip less
I-
than 20
I don't think
if
you
it's
tip.
like a delivery.
I don't think you tip.
Okay,
What?
the reason Mona
You're
just
talking
said,
about. You're talking about if I do at a restaurant. If I do a pickup order. If I
Wait.
Well, hold
wait,
on.
hold
I'm trying
on.
to clarify the situation. All right, so Alan, let me clarify. So are you saying that if I call a restaurant for a pickup order, whether I should tip or not, the
Yeah.
person who hands me the bag?
Yeah, if you drive to the restaurant and you are filling out the transaction and you are walking out with your bags, you know, are you supposed to tip the person that put the
I
stuff
would
in
say
the bag?
I would say no. I would say that there's no social contract in which in that situation where you would need to tip. And that being said, like my wife and I, we made our living on tips for a very large portion of our married life. She was a waitress and I was a pizza delivery person. If the person is just handing you food that someone else prepared and it's just been sitting there, I don't see why you would have to tip. Now, that's not to say that I wouldn't tip just because I'm a default tipper because I know how important it is. But I don't think that there's a social contract in which that situation needs to be tipped.
I feel bad. I feel like I have to. What about you, Mona? Would you tip if you walk in and there's
If I just pick up food, I usually leave at least a buck or two because I appreciate their time and effort. And sometimes the tips get split amongst the kitchen staff and stuff like that. So I don't know. I just feel like I try to err on the side of being generous, but it's also because I've worked in the restaurant industry and I know how shitty people can be. So yeah,
But do you think people
Yeah.
should tip?
I think so. I mean, restaurant workers don't make that much money, you know, and if you can tip, then you should tip.
And it's always percentages for me. So you're saying a buck or two because I always wonder like, should I do 15%? Should I do I usually
I
default.
mean,
to,
yeah,
like,
I don't sit there and
$3
do
or
the
something.
math. Like if
You
I'm
don't?
just picking up like a single meal, like I'll just tip a buck or two. I do know people though who have waited full time and they don't leave anything less than $5 no matter what the order is. And I think that's kind of a cool like a minimum tip amount. Because honestly, like getting a tip of like 75 cents because someone has done the math is like really annoying, right? Like you can't live on 75 cents. I'm not saying you have to tip $5 every time, but I do think there should be like minimum tip amounts that you just do as a courtesy as a human being. But
Okay, so I was actually going to go with a tipping-esque scenario because I recently ordered some furniture and I wasn't sure like which things were tippable and which weren't. Like, are you supposed to tip a plumber or someone who's delivering furniture or something like that? I wasn't sure.
Yes.
are you?
I delivered furniture. Okay, so here I can speak from experience. I delivered furniture for a summer after high school. Beds,
Oh.
specifically. Yeah. And it's always the people who were the least well off that tipped. It was always the rich people that were like, hey, can you run next door and grab this and bring this down the street? And we're always like, oh my gosh.
But is that a
And did they
percentage
tip you?
scenario?
Interesting.
If you're going to tip somebody for refilling your water, why wouldn't you tip someone for carrying your bed up 5 freaking flights of stairs and then assembling it for an hour and a half, and you're going to use that for 10 years? Like, it just makes no sense.
But it's percentage. Like if I buy $1,000 bed, I'm supposed to give you $100 or
No,
or
no.
150.
No,
so it's like what?
It should. I would default. It depends on how much
Like a
work it
20?
is. A 20. A 20 is the gold
Okay.
standard for delivery people if it's something significant. Yeah.
See,
Well,
that's
yeah,
good to
you
know.
can think about their time. Maybe it took like them like an hour or two to like pick up the bed, drive it over, and drop it off.
Absolutely.
So you're paying someone for time rather than effort in that case, right?
And
Or-
and
or
if you're
purchase.
buying, yeah, exactly. And if you're buying a bed that has a canopy that takes like an hour and a half to put together in your attic and it's 115 degrees, you should like. That's actually. Something.
Oh,
This sounds
my
very
God.
specific, Alan.
It's like it was a piece of artwork, I guess. I don't know. Lots of metal connecting parts, and at least don't complain while they're putting it together. But like
No!
maybe offer some
People
water.
are
You
the
know,
worst.
Just
Offer
stand at
them
the door,
soda.
man. It's hot up here. I'm glad I'm not up here, and then walk away.
give them a gospel tract while they're sweating. You know.
Oh, that's awesome. This is what hell's going to be like, folks. So.
You think this is bad?
You don't want to go there, do you?
Hey, if you want to be a good Christian, offer a soda to people at the very, very least. Whoever comes to your house, keep some ginger ale in your fridge. It's important.
Yeah, that's good. Well, that will do it for us this week. If you enjoy what you hear and you want to support Irenicast, you can go to irenicast.com/support for the many ways to show love to the show. Also, if you resonate with our content, check out our Facebook group, Post Evangelicals. We started this group for people like us who want to connect and build community. You can find the link in the show notes to check that out. So for this week, I'm Jeff.
I'm Mona.
And I'm Alan.
Thanks for joining the conversation.
For the cold open, can I suggest that we use if you're going to regulate my condom use, I'm going to regulate your face.
I'm fine with that. Alan, are you okay with condom? You mentioned first.
Condiment. I said that. I was thinking in my head, don't say the word condom, and that's how.
Yeah, let's stop the recording real quick.